And welcome to Introduction to Surname Research and OneName Studies. My name is Julie Goucher. I've been a Guild of OneName Studies member since 2002 when I joined the Guild and registered the Italian surname of Orlando. At that point, there were very few people researching what I will call foreign names, probably because it was just so hard to do. By hard, I mean really being able to access the records because of the individual countries within Europe or wherever else those surnames may have been. So I've been a Guild member for now almost 20 years, and in that time I've benefited from the environment that the Guild is, very much members driven ethos, which is wonderful with some great initiatives. But it's not just that, it's about this special little group of people that make a real difference to other genealogists. And that's what I think is the benefit of having a OneName study, is that it enables you to tap into families that aren't actually yours, but you get to enjoy all those interesting, juicy bits of research that you can undertake. Before I joined the Guild, though, I've been a genealogist since around 1988 and focused very much on, at that point, my maternal line, which came from Surrey, Sussex and Hampshire, with a few other lines in other places, but essentially that was me. So I blog now at angloswest.net, where there is lots and lots of European material as well as OneName Studies materials. So let's get going. So what is a OneName study or surname research? I always find it very strange when you tell people you're doing a OneName study and they think you're crazy. It's so strange because we all have a surname. If anyone was reading the column that I wrote in Family Tree magazine through 2019, I had a column where I could talk 400 words about OneName studies. Anybody who knows me will know I'm an incredibly wordy person. So 400 words was really, really hard to explain some of the detail and just the depth of a OneName study. But we all have a surname, unless you live in Iceland, in which case you won't necessarily have a surname. But that's one of the quirky things about doing a OneName study. So a OneName study is purely and simply is a project focusing on one surname. So I've already said I'm researching my Italian surname, which is Orlando. I'm also researching my mum's family surname, which is Butcher. So they are both very, very different studies, but there's also some similarities between those two. But that's exactly what a study is. It's about a surname in your family history that you just find that you have to research. And that might be for a variety of reasons. So the focus of OneName study is it's global. So it can be researched anywhere and across all time spans. Registration of the Guild for OneName Studies is a huge bonus, as you can see from the slide there. There are lots and lots of member benefits. And I think it's tapping in to those benefits that enable the focus of the study to be much easier. In terms of the study, you can start whichever country you like, whichever time period you like. There is no you must start here situations. It's wherever you want to start. And that is quite sensible in terms of everyone is at different stages in terms of their research. Everyone will be driven by an individual factor, but also it's about where you want to start. So for me on my Orlando study, I really wanted to start in Sicily, which is where my own family came from. But it was really hard getting the records. So the way I could start my study in earnest was to start working on England and Wales, because that's where I live, whilst always then getting the material. Later when we had the internet, accessing material online was much easier. But at the beginning it wasn't much easier. It's been a gradual process, and now there's lots more available online. And if you have access to Ancestry, their global facility, and Family Search, which is free and available to everybody, and you can use those two, you can tap into the material that is from Sicilian and Italian venues, but you can utilize those other two that will help you if you've got some language issues. But equally, you can start wherever you want to start, in terms of, you may choose to start where you live because it's easier to get to. Even though you're researching a Canadian name, actually you may live in another part of the world completely. Maybe that name from Canada actually started its life in Devon, England. You might live in France, but actually you know there's a huge amount of material online that you can access. So that you can choose to start wherever you wish to, based upon your personal circumstances. It makes it much easier. But you can focus on all sorts of things. Migration peaks. You could look at child mortality rates. You could look at particular occupations. There are all sorts of facets that you can disappear into, all under the umbrella of researching a surname. So why bother? Most people find that they have a brick wall and they just can't get over it. And therefore the easiest way is to collect all of the material. So you might decide that you might have in your family somebody that you just cannot find, no matter wherever you look, no matter what spelling of the surname you use, you just cannot find them. So what you do is you then start researching and collecting all these people, and all of a sudden you'll wake up one morning and find you have this Excel spreadsheet or a card index, or however you've kept that material of data, and you think, what am I going to do with that? Tapping into a OneName study can help you try and get over those brick walls. And in some cases it takes time to get over those brick walls, but it's incredibly good fun to be looking at it. I was probably about 9 when I met somebody that had my exact name, and I couldn't explain why, but I was absolutely blown away by the fact that this person was not me, but they had my name, in a kind of a thought process that is only a child's. It had, I don't know, it made an impression on me for whatever reason, and I was always curious. So gradually, as I went into genealogy and then to a OneName study, it happened. But I think it's interesting, and we'll all have those little moments of things that we pick up that we think are just fascinating. So maybe you have an unusual surname. I do have an unusual surname, but it's my husband's. That's a story for a different day. Curiosity over surname distribution. Maybe actually there is a whole pile of people over there, and you think, do they connect to my family? Maybe a OneName study will help you on your path to find out. Maybe there is a myth, a legend, a rumour in your family that perhaps is something that you can work away on really, really quietly by trying to work out if the rumour is indeed true. And then, of course, we had different spellings of surnames, and are they connected? And that's an interesting point in particular, because we spell our surnames because we know how to spell them. So I know that if someone spells my surname Goacher, that's wrong, because that's not my surname. But 150 years ago, that would have probably have been how someone spelt my name, and if I couldn't read, I would have no way of knowing whether it was right or wrong. But of course, it goes even a stage further. What is right or wrong? The only way you can actually establish your surname and the original spelling of that surname is through research and through building up a body of data that will either support you by saying, actually, this is my surname, and look, here is 300 years worth of documents that prove it's never altered at all, and your surname must be completely separate. Or it could simply be a case of, actually, you know what? This is how I spell my surname. We started spelling it this way in 1860, and before then actually it was spelt like this, but it's the same family group. And there's all sorts of things about that you can explore, and that's why you should do a OneName study, is because if you don't do a OneName study, you will miss out on all that incredibly good fun. So anyone who's heard me talk about OneName studies will know I always say a postage stamp or Mount Everest. The Guild tend to use the guidance from the 1881 index. So if there is a reference in the 1881 census and there's 5 of them, yeah, you're probably good to go on that study. If there's 15,000, it's like, do you know what, this is going to be a big study. Well, using that works fine if you're researching a surname that is prevalent in England and Wales. Orlando is not prevalent in England and Wales. It was prevalent in England and in Wales. However, it's a foreign surname. People spell foreign surnames wrong all the time, especially if that surname can be used as a first name, even if that is quite rare. But nonetheless, it happens. So it's important to understand, because if you go into a OneName study and you know you're going to be working on Mount Everest, that's fine. But if you start out and you think this is doable, and then all of a sudden the internet happens and you realise actually it's bigger than Mount Everest, it's a bit of a shock. Now Orlando is definitely bigger than Mount Everest, but it's okay. I'm okay with knowing that one day I'm going to join my ancestors and my study will not be finished. I'm okay with that, and I'm okay because other people will walk behind me and will pick up the study, I hope, and work on it and add there to it. And thereby you're giving your study the additional history. It's not just about the history you're looking at. You actually become part of your study and in that envelope of history. And for the surname of Butcher, again, that's another big study. I registered that when I was completely aware of how big it was going to be. So I have no excuses for saying I had no idea. I did have an idea and I did know it was going to be a big study. And again, I was okay with that. And for me, it was quite important that I registered that name. It kind of equaled me out because there are similarities between the two and there are huge differences between the two. And I think if you know how big a study is going to be, you're forewarned, certainly. Now, there was this great site, and I've not been one of those presenters that doesn't bother changing their slides. I've deliberately left public profile a slide in because it is excellent, and I really hope it's going to come back in some format. And it features quite heavily in the Pharos Introduction to OneName Studies course, which is taught by me. And also what features is the site called forebears.io, which is, I believe, on the handout and the worksheet that I've enabled to be available with this presentation. So Public Profiler was something that was run by one of the universities here in England. It enabled you to map your surname on a global aspect by only collecting 2 bits of information: your email address and your gender. It was just they were building up stats, presumably so they could see how many people of what gender was researching what kind of surnames, I guess. So you just put the name in and this happens. So that's what happens when you put Orlando in. You get lots of white spaces and you get varying shades of blue depending how big the surname is in any particular location. So understandably, Italy is the biggest and darkest patch of blue, followed by the United States, but in between Italy and the United States is Argentina. Then there is Australia, and then you get to other parts of the world, so Canada, most of Europe, including England and Wales. And oh look, there's a patch in India. I will come back to the patch in India in just a few slides. So it just gives you a sense of the detail, so you know how much migration there's been. So yes, this migration pattern here, I can see this. But of course, it's not necessarily the same point, because if you look at Australia and you look at the United States, they've both got the same colour blue, which tells me how much migration there's been. We all know there's been lots of migration to the United States from pretty much anywhere, but in particular from Italy, and that peak happened in 2 or 3 peaks. But perhaps not quite so obvious is the Australian migration, which happened mostly post-Second World War, whereas with the United States, it was pre-Second World War. Not exclusively, but in the main. So, having mentioned the United States, when you clicked on that map, and Forebears does exactly the same, it gives you a map that looks like that. And again, it's the same principle. The darker the blue, the more instances of the surname. So you can see how much migration there's been into that particular state over another. So the areas I'm looking at in particular are states down the east coast, but also over to the west. If you look at places like California, for example, there's quite a lot of Italians in that state. Definitely in New York, New Jersey, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida. I have a theory about some of those migrations, and that's something that I can talk about another day. So then you click on the state and drill down. So for me, I clicked on Louisiana on that last slide, and I got this map. The reason I did that was because I knew there were Orlandos from my own family that went to Louisiana. And this is showing you where the patches are of where there was the most instances of that surname in those areas. And that's why it's really useful, because actually if you decide that you're going to start in the United States and do your research, regardless of where you might live, you're going to start in the United States because that's the biggest concentration for Orlandos outside of Italy, excluding Argentina for the moment. You might decide to start in the actual state where that has the most instances. You might decide to start researching alphabetically. You might decide to do all sorts of things, but you have at least an idea of understanding of exactly how much work you're going to have to do and where you need to be looking. So, types of surnames. There's no there are changes to this, there are variations, of course there are, but this theme kind of runs across most of the surnames in most of the different countries, but there are some oddities. So Orlando is very much a patronymic name. It comes through the male line. You also have little things where they will say Giuseppe de Orlando, where it's literally Giuseppe, the son of Orlando. So it's not quite in the same way, but it is a patronymic name. Equally, occupational names, so butcher, you can see on the slide, is an occupational name, and there are variations, but the names can tell you so much in terms of how they were seen. So my husband, for example, has the surname Redhead in his maternal line. And we were talking one day, and I said to him, of course, I said, you do realise Redhead perhaps was literally that. They had a red head. By red head, they perhaps had ginger undertones. And given that his family were in the northeast, quite close to the Scottish border, was there a hint of Scottish blood perhaps? He just looked at me very blankly. My husband is not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, and just said, if it's anything worth telling me, you'll tell me, won't you, at some point. So there are lots of people out there who are exactly the same as my husband. They will listen to you talk on for a time, then they will glaze over. But in those moments, you get to tell them all the fascinating snippets that you've discovered through your OneName study. And there'll be other things that you can notice. So locational, geographical surnames. So green is, obvious. Red Hill. There are also places that have red and hill as are two separate words. So there are lots of tweaks and changes, but they're the foundations of which are through the type of surname they are. And that just adds extra definition to your study. So with German surnames, they are pretty much the same as the English and Welsh surnames effectively, except they have this wonderful little thing called a Hoffname. And a Hoffname is where an individual will inherit a farm from his father-in-law. And instead of changing the name of the farm, he changes his name to that of his father-in-law. And you find there's that switch between the two names, because I guess we do something very similar here. Is someone will tell you, they will give you a geographical pinpoint when they're giving you directions to somewhere. And they will tell you, you go to the pub, the Red Lion, they tell you the name of the pub, the Red Lion, and then you take the sign up by Joe Blogg's farm. So the farm has a purpose in addition to all the usual farming stuff. It's a landmark. So to avoid having to change the landmark, we change our names in this instance to comply with the fact that the farm doesn't want to change its definition, doesn't want to change its name. The people that own it are going to change to fall in line with the name of the farm. It's interesting, you kind of go, why? But that's all the fun of learning about surnames from different countries. So I'm going to, you can read it on the slide and it just gives you a bit of detail. And it is quite a boring slide, this, because there's so much context here. But what is very, very interesting is that I said Iceland does not have surnames. It was forbidden by law from 1925. By that point, only 10% of Icelanders have an inherited surname. And even them are mostly Danish, or they are from a farm name. But look at the differences on hereditary surnames when they became mandatory. 1801 in Sweden and 1923 in Norway. Now, if I had a Norwegian name, what would I be using up until 1923? That's almost, grandparents' generation, isn't it? If you're kind of my generation, that's almost, depending on how old you are, I guess, parent or grandparent age. So this is within living memory. The Norwegians were only just saying, yeah, do you know what, we're going to use an hereditary surname system. It just makes you think something, it just grabs me as interesting and fascinating. And that's what will happen to you with a surname study. You'll just find all these random things and you will just be blown away by them. And all of a sudden you'll just want to know more. Italian surnames. No surprise that there is a slide that says Italian surnames. So the ones I'm going to touch on are geography, foundlings and a detto. So a foundling is purely that. It's a baby that was found. Most of the babies in Italy and Sicily were left at what is known, and I'm going to describe as a baby wheel. Normally somewhere that would be tended by the nuns or the Catholic Church, and the baby would be taken in and cared for. Most villages would have known if someone had been pregnant and all of a sudden a baby arrives at the nunnery and there's no baby with the mum, you could kind of piece together because, it should be fairly obvious. But if you don't broadcast it, it's kind of okay. It's an interesting concept, but it happens. If you don't see it and you're not aware of it, it's not our business, it didn't happen with me kind of scenario, which I find quite irritating. But it's the way of the world at that point. But, so all these babies were being handed into nunneries and other safe places. What names were they given? If we find a baby here in England and Wales, a baby's abandoned at a hospital or in a car park or somewhere, we tend to give it, or the baby rather than it, the baby is given the name of, even temporarily, of a member of staff or somebody who found the baby. The policeman, the nurse, something along those lines. What they were doing in Sicily and Italy at this point was, if a baby was found, they were given the name, probably, of the town they were found in. Now, I have the surname Licata in my family. Licata is also the name of a place in Sicily. Now, does that mean I've got a foundling in my ancestry? Does it mean that I have a branch of the family that came from Licata at some point? Both of those things are very valid reasons, and I'd need to do more research on those reasons, but it's something to consider. So all these babies were being given the name of the town they were found in, but nobody in the town very often had that name, so they were always going to be focused on as being a foundling. So then they changed the rules and said they were going to give all the babies that were found in Licata the name of somewhere else, but the name they picked was of another town that also was not found in that venue. So you have almost the same thing, is being able to be identified as a foundling just from them trying to mask it. It's sad that it happened, but it did happen, and we have to understand the history and the context of the times our people were living in for us to kind of understand what they were going through. A detto is where you have a name that is not a nickname exactly. It's added into the surname, so we would have it probably as a double-barreled name. And this isn't a double-barreled. It's a name that's added in and then comes down the family line with you and stays with the family line. So I have a surname in my family called Magro Malasso, two completely individual names. All of a sudden, this name just plops into the name, and we have a detto, Magro Malasso, probably given to distinguish two branches of the family from each other. And I've written, for those that are interested, I've written about this on my Anglos West site under probably Italian surnames. And it is just useful to get a sense of the detail of it. But these dettos were kind of interesting because it enabled you to distinguish one family group from another. They may have been connections to their family, they were probably related as family groups, but it's enabling you to distinguish one from the other because of the way Italians in particular repeat names across the generations, following the traditional naming patterns. So it enabled you to distinguish one from the other. Spanish surnames for children, it's not too much of an issue. The father's surname and the mother's surname. For Portuguese surnames, it's even harder because of the way they allocate surnames, and I've definitely written about this on my blog. But you can have up to, 4 surnames, which is incredibly, I won't say strange because, it's just very different. What I do find odd with the Portuguese surnames is two siblings could have completely different names because of how they allocate the surnames. But it is an interesting concept. But of course, if you definitely know that you have a Portuguese family and you can trace how they've been tending to pick surnames, it's really quite useful across siblings. But of course, like with anything these days, the gender equality issue has changed how surnames are added. Effectively, if it cannot be agreed between the parents, the registrant would make the decision of what surname is going to go first. And that seems to be the way the ruling has happened across most of Central Europe. So variants and deviants. So right at the beginning, I talked about surnames and the spellings. And in some ways, that's exactly what a variant and deviant is. One is where a name changes and meanders along using that particular surname change. The other is a deviant. Effectively, it's a spelling mistake. But it's a spelling mistake that happens on a particular document that you know is incorrect, but later on is exactly right. Example, on the 1939 register, my husband's grandmother is referred to as Groucher. She married as Goucher. She lived her entire life as Mrs. Goucher. Um, Her marriage certificate shows her maiden name and her husband's name, which is Goucher. So a deviant is the Groucher name because she got that name for the duration of that one document, but it was completely wrong. A variant is more of a kind of a bubbling along of a name. It's where you get a variation to perhaps the original spelling of the surnames. And as you can see there, I'm talking about Orlando and the two variants I registered. And I kind of registered those on a hunch, really, because if you actually look at cursive script and the way the names are written and the flourish of the pen, it's really easy for an O to become an A, to become an E. I've tended to find out of those variations more Orlandos than Orlandos with an E, but equally there's more Orlandos than either of them, but it sits in the study. And sometimes there'll just be others, and they might just be names that you're not really sure about, so you collect them as you go along. Most guild members will register a surname and no more than 5 variants. Some names have a huge amount of variants. There was one guild member who I can't remember who it is, but they have 27 variants. And it's probably a surname that's got double consonants somewhere in the spelling of the surname, 2 R's, 2 P's, that kind of thing. But if you don't register that, that's absolutely fine. No one's going to pressurize you into registering it. But it might be that actually you want to keep a track of them because maybe there are 2 or 3 different spellings in a relatively small geographical area. So sometimes you note them down because you think they're going to come back into the main name at some point, but you're not absolutely sure, so you just collect them anyway. And it means you have a more substantive database if you're doing that, because it means you'd have to repeat old ground effectively if there is if you need to go back later on. It saves you from doing so. So those of you that remember hopefully that reference I made at the beginning to India when I looked at Public Profiler, so it has to be at least a year ago that I was looking again at this map, the original map, the one that shows you the whole of the globe, and then there was a patch for India. Now I must have looked at that World Profiler map for the Orlando name numerous times, and I don't recall that I'd ever seen the reference on there to India, but I'm pretty sure they hadn't just made it up. I think it was in there all the time. I hadn't noticed it. So I revisited the map. Because it enabled me to drill down, I could see that this was the area where the surname appeared. But then when I went and had a look at family search, there was nothing that kind of told me there just wasn't any in that region. So I went to the Italian mapping site, which is gens.info, and put in the surname. I came to the conclusion that that region was probably in Orlando, but it had been recorded as Orlando with a U, because this is what the map for Orlando looks like in Italy. So it's not looking wild like Orlando is by any stretch of the imagination, but you can see the regions where there is actually a presence, and there's none at all in Sicily. So it's more likely to be perhaps accents. It's more likely to be just penmanship. You know, a quill with a large ink blob, for example. It just made me go back and look, and I think sometimes you need to go back and just have another look at what you already have, especially if you're looking at foreign records. So the instances of Orlando, as I said, are low across the world, but they're there in India. Still they're there. So there is something I kind of want to say it's something and nothing, but it's kind of got my curiosity going, and I'm going to have to delve into it a little more. And I left this in because I wanted to show this example, because it was really important that I could demonstrate to you in some way, even a small way, that actually this is the kind of thing that will drive somebody crazy to the point that you register the name. I'm not quite at the point where I'm going to add this to my variants list, but I have started doing some tentative work on it because I think it's curious. And that's, and a good example of why it's so useful. But you can see there is a darker patch on the map on the right in Italy, and yet there really wasn't very much on the previous map I showed you. And if you look there on this map on the left, again, there isn't huge amounts anywhere, but there is some in that top right corner. I'm guessing that's the bit that probably joins Austria. So maybe it's a mixture of spelling, maybe it's a mixture of accents. At this point, I don't know, but I'm going to spend some time finding out. So the methodology of a OneName study essentially works along these 7 principles. So collecting, gathering data, looking at what you've got, synthesis of the name, so where it's come from, where it's going, other descriptive elements to that, how you're going to publicise your study, communication with your study. This used to be Respond back in the days when you put stamps on envelopes with a piece of paper inside and sent it via the postman. Now we can communicate in all sorts of ways: Facebook, Twitter, blogs, emails. So it became communicate, because sometimes actually it's not even that. Maybe actually it's a DNA match and somebody connects in. So it's useful to get that change to communicate, because we do that in a very different way than we did 40 years ago. Publish and preserve. And preserving a study is really important, because no one wants to spend a lifetime working on a study and then when the time comes and we join our ancestors, to find it's ended up in a skip. So it's really good to be able to have all those elements on there that people can work through. I will say though, it's a continuum. It's not a case of you start 1 to 7 and you do that constantly. You probably collect a batch and work on it, collect a bit more, work on it, and that works great until you find that one of the big databases has a free weekend and you kind of purge as much data from the site as possible, so you haven't got to have a subscription. And it's useful within that regard, and it just gives you some details, so you kind of work your way on this framework. It's useful, and also it means when you're working on something you can keep kind of clear as to where you are and working on the method of your study. So learning about OneName Studies. Again, it's important, as I said, we talked about the methodology and we build on that methodology. So the Researching Surnames booklet that I wrote with the guilds is essentially a kind of this is a kind of get you going kind of kit. It goes out in all the new member welcome packs, which is lovely that it can go out like that. It's available to download as a PDF for all guild members. There have been 2 OneName Studies courses, the introduction course and the advanced course. I take over teaching both from 2020. I've taught the introduction course for 3 years now. But there's also a new course called Practicalities, which slots in between these 2 courses. So you kind of do your introduction, work on your practicalities, which looks at the physical how, there's a practice week and all sorts, and then and then you can go into the advanced course if you wish. There's lots of material on my blog, there's lots of material on the guild website, so there's lots of ways that you can learn about OneName Studies and to get your pre-grounding work, if you like. So as I said, you can learn about continues. That's my blog at the top. The guild benefit, that's what happens to what's available effectively to all guild members, is in those sections. And then Family Tree magazine. I've been lucky enough to write for the magazine. As I said, I've been doing a column for the last year on OneNames and OneName Studies. For 2020, I've switched up and I've gone into a longer quarterly where we build a OneName study going along through the process, which has been great fun. I'm working blind though. I'm working on a study that didn't exist. I'm working on with a surname that isn't one of mine. So I really am starting right back from not quite basics, almost pre-basics, but it's quite good fun and it's a good illustrative point of building a OneName study. So this is the Guild website. The address is onename.org. Just go to the search button and insert your surname. This is the one that's on the right hand side. Insert the surname you're looking for and seeing if it's registered or if there's a surname interest. But also you can see at the bottom of the page how many instances there are of that surname in the Guild indexes, which are all available to members. So there are currently 10,605 surnames registered with the Guild of OneName Studies. And what I want to know is one of them yours? Thank you so much for listening. I hope this quick presentation has been helpful. And if you do have any questions, you are very welcome to email me or visit me at anglersrest.net. Thank you so much. Bye bye now.